It's really a privilege and a pleasure to talk with you today about innovation. This is going to be a strange lecture in some sense because I will provide you with an introduction, roughly speaking, 25 minutes. Then we're going to be having two interviews with two very remarkable scholars and journalists of the contemporary world. The topic, the subject of our discussion today is, let me just try to share my screen with you, and please tell me if, as sometime happens, I'm not succeeding. It's innovation, entrepreneurship, and the role of the state, the role of government, which means, I think, elaborating over two books and the works of two thinkers that we're going to be speaking with later on. One is Matt Ridley, How Innovation Works, a very new book just published this year. And another one is instead Deirdre McCloskey, Bourgeois Equality. It's her last book in a trilogy, go figure, of works on the origin of the Industrial Revolution and how culture really changed the world we live in. So first of all, just a quick clarification. Shall we speak about innovation or shall we speak about invention? Now, invention is a contrivance, a device, a process, a way in which things are produced that originated after application of somebody's mind, that originates after, people thinking about that particular process and that particular need. So an invention is something particular, small. It's a new tool in some way. Innovation is something different. With innovation, we refer to something which is in a way much bigger than invention. Because the very word implies that the invention is becoming so affordable, so reliable, so widespread, that really becomes ubiquitous in the world. So inventions have been with us, with humankind, basically forever. I mean, people have been as creative as they are now in the 5th century before Christ. But innovation instead is a rather new thing. In what sense? Well, look at these. This is world GDP over the last 2 millennia. Now, clearly, there were no Bureau of Statistics in year zero. So all of this is actually the working of economists and historians. The most famous of them all is a chap named Angus Maddison, who actually worked this out a few years ago. What we see when it comes to world GDP, but interestingly enough, it will be basically the same thing if we go and look at world population. What we see is that growth has been something basically happening in the last 2 centuries. I mean, for most of the history of humankind, GDP, generally speaking, the production of wealth has been a flat line. You got better seasons, you got worse seasons, but they were balancing somehow one after the other. Clearly, you got moments of prosperity, but then all of a sudden, an epidemic or a pandemic came, a war came. And basically, you went back to the starting point. What happened in the last 2 centuries is instead that the world we live in changed so dramatically that now we are accustomed to economic growth. We expect GDP statistic year after year, hoping that the country, for example, will grow a bit more. We're clearly very worried about the current situation after COVID-19, which basically means everywhere that we got a GDP contraction. But such a contraction is not the norm, is not what we do expect. And likewise, in our life, we are waiting every year for new things, for a cell phone that works better, for instruments to use when we do our cooking so that better, and so on and so forth. So what we got in the last 2 centuries by one of our friends that we're going to be speaking with later on, Professor Dylan McCloskey, has been called the Great Enrichment. Why the Great Enrichment? For the reason she points out here. Basically, from 1800 to our days, real income has been raising tremendously in a very in a number of countries. It was, of course, at the beginning, so to say, Western countries, but now they're expanding, has been raising by a factor of 10 or 30 or even 100. So in 1800, in what can be considered, rich country by that time, England, France, people were basically earning in today's dollar the equivalent of $2 or $3 a day, and that was basically the norm for human beings since prehistory. But now, in so-called Western or First World countries, the average income is some $100 a day. Yeah, somewhere is even more. These happen not because of magic, but because innovation became pervasive. So the other person we're going to be talking with, Dr. Matt Ridley, who's instead is a journalist who has worked for quite a few years at The Economist covering science. Ridley says innovation is the most important fact about the modern world, but one of the least well understood. It's the reason why most people today live better lives, at least from a material point of view, of course, than our ancestors, our forerunners used to. But, very often innovation is not understood in its dynamics properly. What are these dynamics? The key idea, I think, is expressed very vividly by Matt Ridley by saying that ideas have sex. So what is prosperity? Prosperity comes from, he writes, everybody working for everybody else. We achieve a certain amount of prosperity. We actually live in our modern civilization basically because in a division of labor, we can rely on other people's knowledge, on other people's skills, instead of, doing everything by ourselves. So it is trade, it is sharing ideas, and it is clearly what comes out of sharing ideas and sharing goods, which is the possibility of specialization that set living standards on a rising trend. So Ridley is a scholar of evolution and says that exchange is basically to cultural evolution what sex is to biological evolution. Ideas basically mate, and by mating, they generate baby ideas. Other ideas that have the traits of the father idea and of the mother idea. And some of these baby ideas are useful, some of them are not. If you consider one of the greatest innovation, and perhaps the most iconic innovation of the early industrial age, which is the steam train, well, that is, in a sense, really the quintessential example of ideas having sex. So a steam engine mated with wagons, rail tracks, and what came out was really an invention that was based upon very important inventions at that time, and foster a tremendous wave of innovation that changed really the world we live in. Just a very quick thing. This year has been quite different than others in our lifetime when it comes to mobility. But we are in the summer, and in the summer people used to do some tourism, right? To go here and there, to visit the lake, go to the seaside, go hiking in the mountains. Tourism as an experience basically did not exist before the Industrial Revolution. The only people that could move for the season were aristocrats, landowners, very rich guys. But common people, they couldn't just take a horse and go to the seaside for the weekend. The train was the first thing making that possible by cutting time in transport, and at the very same time by providing people with cheaper transport option than ever before. So if the key to understand innovation is ideas having sex, I think that the interesting question is, who is the matchmaker? Who is introducing idea A to idea B and waiting, for them to produce baby ideas. Now, there is really a tendency, and the core message, to say, of my lecture and of this hour should be that you should take that way of thinking with really a grain of salt. There is a tendency to believe that ideas are always the output of grand plans, of designs, of visions. If you read politicians, of course, they are designing the future. In Italy these days, we are having a discussion about the telephone national grid, and people are speaking about having a broadband which is future-proof, and that, of course, should be coming out of the grand vision of some planners and some ministers in Rome. But also, if you need people active in consultancy, for example, they likewise tend to emphasize the importance of great visionary and new ways of putting together human resources or capital, which is really need for that grand investment, which clearly will produce a certain result. Now, clearly, when it comes to innovation and entrepreneurship, there is certainly a role which is played by conspicuous human beings, by innovators, by people that have a vision and foresee the future. But most of the time, innovation is something which happens bottom up, out of very practical, simple needs. And most of the time, it is actually something which is serendipitous, and whose results in the long time are not foreseen. This is just an example I put there, but in 1999 there was the first telephone that incorporated a camera. If those guys could foresee the Instagram civilization, so to say, we are living in, they would have made a tremendous success, much bigger than they did. They had more practical needs. They had more clearly a smaller vision, but eventually an innovation that they contributed to with much smaller aim, it ended up changing the way in which we all live. In this context, as I said, clearly entrepreneurs are playing an important role, and there's no reason to deny that. An entrepreneur is always a tricky person to describe. An entrepreneur is someone who, at the very same time, organizes, manages a firm, business, but also assumes the risks behind it. The entrepreneur is, in a way, an agent of change. That's the Schumpeterian view of the entrepreneur. He's an innovator. I'm sorry, who basically constantly strives to achieve new goods or new methods of production. At the very same time, another economist, Israel Kirzner, taught us to look at entrepreneurs in terms of alertness. So what really makes an entrepreneur is the fact that an entrepreneur is more alert to profit opportunities. And so he looks for them, he sees them where other people are not seeing them, and clearly exploits them. To give you a sense of what the entrepreneurial activity is, I put here a quote from Francis Scott Fitzgerald, The Last Tycoon, I think also a popular production this day. And this last tycoon, this great businessman, he says, when I was young, I wanted to be a chief clerk. So the one guy who in the office always knows where things are. And he says, being a businessman is something like that, is organizing the factors of production and knowing where the different things are. Of course, the entrepreneur is typically associated with the idea of capitalist accumulation, in a sense with the value of prudence. And the value of prudence is important, but cannot be the only thing behind innovation. Because prudence, after all, brings you to be very cautious, to think about whatever you need to do next. Whereas, of course, innovating, being an agent of change, requires courage, requires hope. This is something which is conveyed by Keynes's word, animal spirits, who are behind business, well, inside, actually, businessmen. But even if you think about Uncle Scrooge, here in a portrait of Karl Barks, even Uncle Scrooge, who's super prudent, at the very same time is very enterprising. He went to Klondike. He's always trying to improve his own wealth, his own condition, by becoming richer, not exclusively by saving, but by attempting adventures, by trying to open up new ways and new paths for himself. Now, the entrepreneurs are important, but one thing which is particularly important when it comes to innovation, and which is very often underlooked, is consumers' feedback. Innovation is constantly market tested. A market economy is, in a way, akin to a giant democracy, where people are voting constantly every day as consumers by pricing certain products and instead refusing to buy others. So we do have spectacular examples in history of consumer sovereignty, of this fact that consumers exercise, their own ability to choose, and therefore they determine the future of a product. So, for example, in the 1980s, Coca-Cola tried to change the recipe of Coke. Back at the time, actually, Coke was not gaining in popularity vis-a-vis Pepsi. Actually, it was the other way around. So the executive in Atlanta at Coca-Cola, they tried to come up, with this new drink and have this new Coke that was allegedly going to be better than the old Coke. This new Coke was tested in focus group. It was supposed to be future-proof. It was supposed to be, this grand vision for the future of Coke. Well, consumers didn't like it. And Coke at the very same time decided, to go back to the old recipe. If you think about, that product down there, the Segway, that we've seen in movies, in documentaries. When the Segway was launched, the Segway was supposed to be, the greatest invention ever since the wheel. People were betting hard that the Segway was about to revolutionize the way in which people move in cities. Of course, as you know, the production of the Segway was terminated a few weeks ago. So entrepreneurs, managers, CEOs, they have visions. They have ideas about the future. Scientists, researchers have ideas about the future, but these ideas ought to be tested. Ought to be tested in the marketplace and therefore, selected by consumers. Some of these ideas go great. Some of these ideas do not do so. What happens? What happens in this context? Well, the important thing is that mistakes, and this is what proper incentives in a market economy are about. Mistakes become an occasion for learning, for understanding better what consumers want, what they do, and what they do desire. In a sense, learning is really the essence of innovation. Is learning about new technique, learning about new science that allows us imagine and produce new stuff. But also learning is what happens every day. There is no innovation which is future-proof or bulletproof. People make mistakes constantly. But these mistakes are a source of learning. And this is why we need, whenever we are thinking about innovation, to see it as the product of a decentralized order. This is a sentence from Karl Popper, The Poverty of Historicism, very important book. Popper says, it is easy to centralize power, but it's impossible to centralize all that knowledge which is distributed over many individual minds, and whose centralization would be necessary for wielding centralized power wisely. What does he mean? It means that it's relatively easy to centralize power in our society. To centralize power over the relevant decision-making process when it comes to new product and the economy at large, and so on and so forth. What is actually difficult is to get all the informations that are needed to take good decision. Why is this an important thought? This is an important thought because when it comes to innovations being market tested, we're actually referring to the fact that people day after day, by making their own choices, with their own interest in mind and with their own needs in mind, they're actually facilitating the process on the entrepreneurial side to come up with a better view of what they want and what they do not want. Also, it's very difficult to conceive a product, to think about a way of producing tech in abstract. And this is why, actually, when it comes to productive innovation, they typically do not come in the abstract. They come bottom up. They come from the day-to-day experience of people. So, in a sense, what we shall take away is the idea that there is no linear model. So one very common misconception is that if we want innovation, so if we want to live in a world that produces new things and have better living standards day after day, year after year, and as increasing wealth, we need to invest money in science. Science will produce technology. and technology will make us rich. Well, clearly, I mean, it's important to put money on research and innovation, but there is no guarantee. It's not science per se. It's not research per se, but is working on stuff that later on is subject to the judgment of consumers and is somehow packaged, produced, put on the table by people that can correct their path if they understand they're making mistakes. So this is why it is so difficult, actually, in the real world to pick winners. It's very difficult for private funds. This is why investments by private funds are typically diversified. You have no 100% certainty that even the most promising of businesses will bear its own promises, but it's very difficult, particularly by political authorities. Picking winners was and is the essence of so-called industrial policy. Industrial policy is predicated upon the idea that experts, properly empowered by governments, by states, well, they will be in a position to know in advance which technology is going to work best, which company is more promising, and so on and so forth. Actually, this is very, very complicated. It's very, very different from the nature, because the nature of innovation itself. I do have other things I would like to talk with you about, and we certainly will do that later on in the Q&A session. But now I would like you to stay with me and listen together to the two interviews with Matt Ridley first and Deirdre McCloskey second. If Lorenzo, if we can go with the interviews. We're here with Matt Ridley, whose last book is How Innovation Works. In your last book, How Innovation Works, you frequently write that innovation happens. Why does innovation happen? Isn't innovation the result of conscious and well-planned efforts and contrivances?
I come to the conclusion that innovation is not the product of clever planning by clever people, but is an almost inevitable phenomenon arising out of people exchanging and trading with each other and wishing to find ways to collaborate on new projects and become more specialized in what they do and so on. And so it's very much a bottom-up view of innovation rather than a top-down one. It's not wholly inevitable. Obviously, people do have to set out to try and achieve certain goals when they're creating innovations. But I think it is really important to see how much we can't force innovation to go in directions which it's impossible to go in, and we can't plan where it's going to go, and we can't foresee where it's going to go. It's surprisingly unpredictable, innovation. We don't really know where the breakthroughs are going to come. In that, I mean, I go right back to the question of why it happens, why human beings innovate and rabbits and rocks don't. And I think the answer is because of this habit of exchange and specialization, which gives us the chance to develop technologies and institutions that become more and more good at what they do to help our lives.
One thing that you write and you point out is that innovation is perhaps the most important phenomenon in the modern world. It's clearly behind modern economic growth, but it is also one of the least understood. Why do you think it's so? Why people do not understand this bottom-up view of innovation? Because on the other hand, we do have some moments of collective enthusiasm for innovation. Moon landing, great discoveries clearly are capturing people's imagination. But generally speaking, I think your point is that the way in which innovation happens escapes our mind.
Yeah, I think people are, on the one hand, people like innovation. On the other hand, they resist it. But if you ask people, why does it happen? What is the cause of this happening? You'll get a lot of different answers. And it's surprising how unprecise the analysis of this is. I mean, one of the ways I talk about this is how difficult economists have found it to put innovation into their mathematical models, into their equations, if you like. And arguably, they just didn't for 200 years put it in. I mean, Adam Smith clearly saw that the division of labor would lead to innovation. He talks about it in his pin factory example. But that is kind of left aside then by the economics profession for really a century or two, while they go on talking about equilibrium and the invisible hand, which implies the opposite of innovation. It implies diminishing returns. It implies that we will, run out of ways of improving our lives as we reach perfect equilibrium. Whereas clearly that's not the case. Clearly we've seen increasing returns to investment over time, and by the time the economics profession became very mathematical in the 20th century, it simply had to sort of throw in a fudge factor called "and innovation happens," just like that. Paul Romer then has a go more recently at saying, no, you have to understand that innovation itself is a product. You invest in innovation like you invest in everything else. But you do so by investing in new knowledge, and new knowledge is shared, and that results in innovation, and you get sort of tacit knowledge, which gives you an advantage to applying innovation. But none of this really tells you why it's happening in one sector and not another, why it's happening in one country and not another, why it's happening faster at some times than at other times. So I think a grand unified theory of innovation still eludes us.
It does. Do you think there is a parallel with entrepreneurship? I mean, entrepreneurs were somehow a very mysterious thing for economists for quite a while. And in a sense, I suppose that some of the characteristics, some of the features that you find in great innovators and inventors, for example, during the Industrial Revolution, you find them in entrepreneurs too. I mean, both this kind of persona, I mean, both innovators and entrepreneurs, somehow are agents of perturbations in equilibrium.
That's a very good way of putting it. And yes, I mean, I think by using the word innovator rather than inventor, I'm effectively talking about entrepreneurs. Almost by definition, an entrepreneur is an innovator because they're trying to start a company that does something new. If it wasn't doing something new, it wouldn't be worth starting. I mean, they might be doing something that others do, but in a better way with more cost saving or more efficiency or something, but that's an innovation in itself. So this is very much the story of the entrepreneur rather than the story of the person who comes up with the new widget, new gadget. And actually, that's one of the things I try to do in my book, is to redress the balance away from our emphasis on the academic genius who comes up with the first idea, and more towards the person who turns an idea into something that is practical, affordable, reliable, and available to all people. because that's a lot of work. It's often much more work than coming up with the original prototype. I often cite the example of Thomas Edison. He would probably have called himself an inventor rather than an innovator, because the word wasn't around much at the time. But I think he's really more of an innovator, because he takes things that are already in existence, like the first light bulbs. He was not the first person to come up with a light bulb. But he then does an extraordinary amount of hard work to try to find out how to make light bulbs reliable so that they don't blow up after 10 minutes or 2 hours or something like that. And he eventually, after testing 6,000 different types of plant material, he settles on Japanese bamboo to provide the filament for his reliable light bulb. So that's an example of the importance of trial and error, the importance of hard work, which goes into entrepreneurship, innovation, which is more than just inventing something. It's very much about turning it into a practical opportunity.
But if I may nudge you towards another example you make in the book, which is perhaps a bit forgotten these days, particularly outside of England, and I suppose particularly outside of York, where you got a marvelous railway museum, may nudge you towards George Stephenson. In a way, his story is so incredible, and it seems to me to be, really exemplary of what happened during the Industrial Revolution, and the sort of people that actually made the modern world as we know it.
George Stephenson is almost my biggest hero as a person, partly because he lived in the same part of the world that I live in Newcastle in the northeast of England. Partly he came from very humble origins. He wasn't really literate. He hardly went to school, but he was a good engineer. He worked on steam engines. He became famous as an engine doctor, that is, someone who could mend an engine or redesign an engine so that it worked better. And he then began to apply his mind to the idea of locomotives. And again, he wasn't the first person to build a locomotive. In fact, there were several other people doing so at the same time. But he gradually hit upon ways to make them better and more efficient. And at the same time, he realized that a locomotive was only as good as the rails it was running on. And the weight of locomotives was a real problem for wooden railways and for the first iron railways. So he put a huge amount of effort into understanding how to design rail tracks. And he started with cast iron, and he eventually gave up on that and went to wrought iron. And eventually came up with a system, both the locomotive and the railway on which it ran, that would work. Now, the interesting thing is that when he did this in the early 1820s, pretty well everybody else had given up on this. Lots of people had tried to build steam engines that could drag wagons along railways, and they'd done so locally for a colliery or something like that. But then they'd found that it just couldn't compete with horses. It was far too expensive to maintain. It was far too difficult. In a curious way, the steam engine was a dying technology when George Stephenson grabbed it by the scruff of the neck and turned it into something that actually did work, and then sold the idea to somebody who was about to build a horse railway and said, no, please design it in such a way that we can run locomotives on it, a really long one. This was from Stockton to Darlington. And then a huge amount followed. And his son was important too. Robert Stephenson was also a very good engineer. And they just kept tinkering away, so that, for example, putting lots of tubes of water through the boiler, having tubes in the boiler so that lots of tubes of water go through the fire so that the whole thing heats up much quicker, exhausting the steam into the where the smoke goes, would draw on the fire to make more heat. All sorts of small changes to the design of the locomotive that made it more reliable, more effective, So it's a fantastic story, and it's often forgotten about these days. You're right. The Victorians were fascinated by the story of George Stephenson. He really was an entrepreneur and an innovator. And because he came from a humble background, he probably wasn't initially taken seriously enough. There's a story about the miner's lamp that he invented, safety lamp, so that you could have a lamp down underground, which wouldn't set off an explosion if you ran into a pocket of gas. And he basically came up with a design that worked. Sir Humphrey Davy, a very grand scientist, also did so at the same time. But it looks like Davy pinched the idea off Stephenson, who got very, very cross about it. But the world believed that Stephenson had pinched the idea off Davy because, what could he know? He's just an engineer. He's not a scientist.
Well, I think this is a very important point. I mean, Stephenson was an engineer, but of course not in the sense engineers are engineers these days. I mean, he never went to university, didn't spend 5-6 years studying this stuff. In many ways, the history of the Industrial Revolution is the history of tinkerers. Nowadays, in our public discourse of innovation, the idea is basically that you got certain inputs that give you an innovative society. University education, R&D, mostly financed by governments in Europe. Is it simply that the world has changed? Or are we somehow forgetting about the importance of tinkering, of innovation, so to say, being realized bottom up or on the street, if you like?
I don't think the world has changed in that respect at all. Because if you look at the innovations that have dominated the last few decades, mostly based around the internet, mobile telephony, the digital world generally, they have mostly come around through tinkering. The tinkering may be in software, or it may be in silicon rather than in metal or large machines, but it is essentially tinkering that goes on. Somebody designs something, somebody else fiddles with it and makes a slightly better version. Somebody else takes that and combines it with something else and comes up with a better version. And then somebody tries to sell something else and fails. And then somebody tries something else and succeeds. There is not a process here whereby somebody has had a brilliant plan and carried it out, either at a university or in industry or in government. If you just to sort of compare Jeff Bezos with George Stephenson, this is a man who has dragged online retail into our lives over a period of 30 years, having the vision to see what is possible. In the late 1990s, looking like he had failed. Amazon was not a great success. He went on a buying spree and acquiring a lot of .com companies, nearly all of which went broke. He went into industries that didn't work, into sectors and ventures that didn't work. Amazon was attacked by the markets as a overvalued company that was going nowhere. But gradually, bit by bit, he has put together a system for managing online retail. There's a lot of other stuff to Amazon too, like Amazon Web Services now. But let's focus on the online retail side. Opening it up to third-party sellers was an extraordinary and brave decision that a lot of people thought wouldn't work, and so on. So it's very much a story of tinkering. Show me the philosophical, scientific, academic breakthrough insight at the start of that process. It's not there. It's a matter of taking the existing things and playing with them and trying different versions. Now, even something that does seem to come out of academia, like gene editing, the CRISPR technology, that is a very exciting, precise form of editing DNA sequences in plants and crops, and perhaps even for medical reasons. That, it's basically a discovery by MIT and the University of California at Berkeley, and they are fighting over the patent, and they're fighting over the Nobel Prize, and so on. But when you look at the history of it, they were essentially picking up on a hint from some work in the yogurt industry in France, where scientists working for yogurt companies are interested in bacterial diseases, because if your bacteria catch a virus, then they don't work so well at making yogurt out of milk. So they're studying bacterial diseases, and they picked up on a hint from an academic who was working on a salt-loving bacteria, not a bacterium, actually an archaeal, a microbe, in Spain, where the salt industry is quite big in the local and funds the local industry. Now, they had both picked up on these weird sequences in the DNA of bacteria that seemed to be involved in protecting against viruses, and that had very precise DNA recognition devices in them. And this was then capable of being turned into an editing tool. So very interestingly here, the academic discovery kind of comes out of industry, and the practical application kind of comes out of universities at a later stage. So the idea of a linear process where you start with academic discovery and you end with practical spin-offs is not true. The way I put it is that science is the seed of technology and innovation sometimes, but it is also sometimes the fruit. And innovation is the seed and science is the fruit.
In one of your previous books, a great book actually, The Rational Optimist, you coined a wonderful expression, which is ideas have sex. It actually entered, I think, the public discourse. It was used by plenty of scholars and authors because it's so effective. And I think it's also crucial to understand innovation. Can you elaborate on that, explain it in a nutshell to our students?
Mm-hmm. Brian Arthur at Stanford wrote a book in which he argued that every technology is a combination of other technologies. It's hard to think of an exception to that. Everything we're using combines different things. And perhaps you have to go back to the Stone Age to find single technologies, if you like. So in terms of how we make new technologies, what we basically do is combine existing technologies in novel ways, in novel combinations. And that, curiously, is how evolution works, biological evolution, because biological evolution takes a genetic mutation and combines it with another genetic mutation from a different lineage to make an interesting combination. It's cumulative in the sense that it can accumulate things from different lineages. Now, the process that makes that possible in biological evolution is sex. That is to say, if we weren't sexual beings, then a brilliant biochemical mutation that happens in my body and a brilliant biochemical mutation that happens in my wife's body could never come together in our children, for example, or whatever it might be. So sex enables genetic mutations to combine and recombine. Now, exactly the same process happens in human innovation. That is to say, we bring together ideas from different machines, different things, and put them together. And the process analogous to sex is therefore trade or exchange, because that is having exactly the same effect as sex is having. So I was making a really quite precise, deliberate analogy to the biological definition of sex. I wasn't trying to be sort of sassy, but actually it's quite a precise analogy, because ideas meet and mate, and they have baby ideas with the characteristics of both parental ideas. And my favorite example of this is a thing called a pill camera, which came about after a conversation between a gastroenterologist and a guided missile designer. And they both came up with the idea of a pill that you could swallow and that would take a picture of your insides.
Matt, a very last question. You've been following right from the beginning the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course that is really creating a need for robust medical innovation.
Excuse me.
Well, bless you. How you think we're doing on that front? Is the world we live in delivering on the promise of medical innovation when it comes to dealing with these kind of risk, or not really?
I'm very disappointed in how little innovation we have achieved in, for example, vaccine development or medical diagnostic devices, because this pandemic has showed that we are nothing like as advanced as we could be in either of these technologies. It takes years to develop a vaccine for a new virus, and it's a very uncertain process with a relatively low rate of success. If you think how much mobile phones have improved in the last 30 years, wouldn't it be nice if vaccine development had improved as fast as that in the last 30 years? And I think it would have been possible for it to do so, because there are lots of ideas about how to produce new vaccines using messenger RNA or whatever it might be. You know, there are lots of thoughts about it, but most of them stay on the drawing board. And the reason they do is partly because the pharmaceutical industry finds it difficult to make profits out of vaccines, so they don't invest in it to the same extent as they do in drugs, because on the whole, you only take a vaccine once, and if the epidemic goes away, then the company can't make money out of it anymore. So there hasn't been the private sector investment in vaccines that there should. And as for the public sector, well, I think it's very revealing that vaccine development has been relatively underfunded compared with, say, climate change research. And I make that comparison very deliberately because the World Health Organization said in 2015 that the greatest threat to human health in the 21st century is climate change. Now, this suggests an organization that is not doing its day job of looking out for pandemics and the threats that they pose. This isn't the organization charged with looking after climate change. This is supposed to be the organization looking out for infectious diseases. So I think both the public and the private sector have neglected vaccine development. Now, very recently, the Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust in the UK put their heads together and said, we need to change this. And so they've set up something called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, and Sept. And the idea is to get platforms of vaccine development ready so that when there's a pandemic, we're much quicker off the mark. But unfortunately, it only started work in 2017, and it hadn't made much progress by the time this pandemic came along. That should have been done 20 years ago, and it should have been done by the World Health Organization or by governments. And if it had been, then I think we would be facing a much better prospect. I suspect that after this pandemic, we will get much better at making vaccines much more quickly. And we'll probably end up with vaccines against the common cold and things like that. So we'll be able to live lives that are even healthier. Although we'll then have to deal with the problems of allergies and hay fever and that sort of thing, which come as a result of us not having parasites in our system. That's another story. So on the medical front, we need more medical innovation. We've neglected it. We've made it too difficult to innovate in medical devices and too easy to innovate instead in video games and things like that.
Well, thank you very much to Matt Ridley, the author of How Innovation Works.
Thank you, Alberto. It's great to be with you today, and I hope to see you in person soon.
Well, me too. Thank you so much. Lorenzo?
Yes. Okay.
Just
Okay.
Let me make the
Professor McCluskey, why do you prefer the word innovism to capitalism?
Well, you know, the word capitalism was coined by the enemies of a free market society, and it embodies a scientific mistake in a single word, because it's not true, as we've all thought since even Adam Smith, that capital accumulation is what made us rich. If you just accumulate capital, you know, you build another house for yourself, and then a third and a fourth. Kind of obviously, the returns on the fourth house are not going to be very high. So it's it's clear that sheer capital accumulation, which is deeply suggested by the very word capitalism, is not the way forward or the way to explain the past.
So how important is innovation for modern economic growth?
It's crucial, and that's why I prefer the word innovism to describe what's happened since about 1800, starting in Britain and then in the West generally, and now in large parts of the world. It's thinking up new ways of doing things that makes us rich. Steel, inexpensive steel from the middle of the 19th century on, the steam engine from the middle of the 18th century on, sewerage treatment in the very late 19th century, the invention of cheap paper and the steam press that makes the modern newspaper possible. Everyone mentions the computer, but they forget about radio, and on and on and on. And so it's innovation that made us rich, not making a second, third, fourth house for yourself. It's new ideas, and they're not just these mechanical inventions. They're also institutional inventions. The modern university, invented in 1810 in Berlin. The containerization, which is simply organizational and doesn't involve much, certainly not much science at all. Containerization has transformed international trade, and indeed the coming of free trade, especially after the Second World War, is another innovation. And then down at the lower, so supposedly lower level, the innovation that someone exercises when they open a new hairdressing salon, which, by the way, I need right now, or someone who goes courageously from Calabria to Chicago in 1910. Those are innovations too. They're new ways of doing things. That made us rich.
Sometimes you refer, and even now you mention, the years after 1800 as the age of innovation. So that's quite recent in time.
It is.
We have innovation before that.
Yeah, we have innovation for sure. Humans and even chimpanzees are innovative. We invented the bow and arrow, which was a large invention. We invented the wheel. It's sort of the classic, almost comical example. And we invented the Arabs invented the windmill. In fact, the Indians, the South Asians, and the Mayans invented place value for numbers, which was a gigantic improvement. But these improvements were slow, too slow to overcome the Malthusian pressures of population. So the Arabs invent with the windmill. It's famously adopted in Spain and then even more famously in Holland. But, it takes a while to sort of get it going. Meanwhile, the improvement that it causes increases population. People say, oh boy, I can have more kids, or more kids survive because there isn't as much starvation. And you get higher population, and the diminishing returns to population intervene. I mean, the most spectacular example of this is the invention of agriculture, which happens in 9 separate places all over the globe. Starting in around 8,000 BCE. Well, agriculture made it possible for people to be agriculturalists and to stand there and grow crops. But of course, it also made them able to have more kids. When you're a hunter, gatherer, there are all kinds of ways of reducing your fertility because you don't want vastly increased numbers of kids in your wandering group. And yet it didn't substantially increase, in fact, at all, increase the welfare of the ordinary person. It had other good effects, urbanization, and therefore the invention of writing and so forth. But for ordinary people, it's the old case of the hockey stick, the old sort of cliche about economic growth, which is that up until, I'll do it along the bottom here, from 300,000 BCE, when our race, namely the human race, got started, the Homo sapiens, you get $2 or $3 a day. And then finally in 1800, what happens is, now watch, boom, whoops, I've gone in the wrong, it's hard to make it work. Boom, no, I'm going the wrong direction. Boom, it goes up by a factor of 30. The average Italian is 3,000% better off in material terms than she was in 1800. 3,000%, completely unprecedented. So it overcame the Malthusian pressures, and in fact, of course, since 1800, population has increased by a factor of over 7. But in the meantime, output has increased by, this enormous amount because of innovation, thus innovism.
So the life of the ordinary people, before the so-called Industrial Revolution, was pretty much the same over ages. Peasants in the 5th century led a life that was somehow comparable to peasants in the 14th century.
That's right.
You have explained the Industrial Revolution, or modern economic growth, better to say, by and large, because of a bourgeois re-evaluation, so a change in culture. Can you explain that to us?
The argument, it's not so much the Industrial Revolution, that's the phrase we normally use. That was classically between around 1750 to 1850 or so, and it doubled income per head in, say, Britain. But then from 1850 to 1900, it doubled again, and then again, and then again. So we're talking about a factor of 8 or 16 or 32, these enormous increases. And what's the cause? It's not Christianity, as some people argue. It's not science, as my dear friend Joe Mokir argues, because science has its economic effects much too late to explain this. It's a change in the attitude of and it's not an improvement in the spirit, the Geist of entrepreneurs themselves. It's not, I'm not Max Weber in drag or something. It's not about a psychological change among merchants and manufacturers. It's about a change in the attitude of the rest of the society towards them. And in all agricultural societies, up to 1800 or so, there's this crushing opposition to innovation, which in English, for example, I'm sure the same is true in Italian, is a bad word until the 19th century, to merchants as against landlords. Landlords are honorable. They have their swords and their horses, and that makes them honorable, or priests are honorable, but not merchants. Merchants are bad. And that changes. And of course, where it changes is crucial. It changes first in Holland in the 16th and especially the 17th century. And then that's translated into England. England gets a Dutch king in 1689 and adopts all kinds of Dutch institutions. Unfortunately, the national debt is among them. And England becomes Dutch in its attitude towards merchants and manufacturers. And then it happens in Scotland as well. And then it happens in some of the North American colonies. And then it spreads to places like Belgium in the early 19th century and Italy in the late 19th century. And we're off to, as we say in English, we're off to the races. So it was a sociological and political change. The coming of liberalism in particular, which is an 18th century invention. There's not the, there's this crazy idea that it's Christianity's talk about the individual soul that is the basis for all this. And this, I think, is very implausible. It's recent, as you said before. It's surprisingly recent. It's in the 18th century that it stops being scandalous to say that a person in business is okay. Voltaire, for example, says that a person in business is okay. He very much admired England. And then we have Adam Smith, I always cross myself, and Mary Wollstonecraft and John Stuart Mill and so forth. And it's that made for innovism because it inspirited ordinary people to, as the English say, have a go. And go they did.
Have a go. Do experiments. Try.
Try.
This is really a mentality, an attitude. What are the dangers for this mentality, for this attitude, particularly today? Who is up against it? What shall we fear in the future of innovism and prosperity?
Well, actually, it's not surprising. What's depressingly predictable is that when a lot of young people stop having to go into trade and get to go to university where they can read stuff, Marx and so forth, they then become opponents of the bourgeois revaluation. And it's very striking in the 19th century how many of the critics of what they called capitalism were the sons, especially the sons, not so much the daughters, but the sons of merchants and manufacturers. And it happens over and over again. Marx's father was a lawyer. And of course, his friend Engels was himself a manufacturer. But it happens again and again and again that there's a fathers and sons what would you call it, dynamic here, that the sons become members of what I call the clerisy, you and I, for example, the speakers and writers and intellectuals, so-called, and then they find this attack on capitalism to be, I don't know, amusing. Now, there's a more deep problem, I think, which is that we grow up in, I hope, loving homes, households. Mom is the economic central planner. Dad pours resources that come from a mysterious place called the office. And so the child, the sensitive child, not Donald Trump, but the emotionally sensitive child, when she discovers age 13 or 14 that there are poor people in the world, says, aha, the solution is to bring the poor people into my family because my family is nice. And this family analogy, what they called in Sweden in the late 1920s, the national home, is what lies, I think this, one could find out whether this is true or not, is what lies behind the socialist impulse. That's one source of it. Namely this belief that a society of 60 million people or 330 million people can be a nice little home. And as Hayek said, that doesn't work very well. The great societies, he called it, these large societies, can't be run on love. Now, I'm in favor of love. I'm a Christian liberal. And I think love is crucial, even in the operation of the economy. But I don't think that you can just depend on people being nice to each other. Or to put it another way, you can point out that an arm's length economic transaction is being nice to other people. You know, when I bought a little accordion from the Czech Republic a few years ago. I don't practice, so I haven't learned how to use it. But it's a wonderful little thing. And because I could trade, because I was not self-sufficient, I didn't have to make my own accordion. Well, you know. So the great society has to operate. Of course, it has these homes, and I honor them. In fact, it's very important that people receive the ethical education from their mothers and to some degree from their fathers that makes them ethical actors in an innovistic society. So I'm not banishing ethics and saying all that matters is self-interest. No.
We've been living a few peculiar months, so to say, ever since the COVID-19 pandemic has been on the newspaper's front page. In this process, many people have spoken about innovation, particularly in medical science, and how to find a vaccine, how to develop better treatment.
Yeah.
But sometimes the impression has been that innovation is dependent exclusively upon investment.
Yeah.
You put a lot of money on the table and innovation will develop. Is it so?
No, it's well, one could call it the Manhattan Project fallacy. That is the Allies, thank God, got the atomic bomb before the Germans did. Because I think it's fair to say the government, the American government in particular, but also the British government, put masses of investment into this one innovation, and it worked. But that analogy then keeps being used over and over and over again. It's sort of the way the Munich analogy in another sphere keeps being used over and over and over again, causing disasters in that case, like American involvement in the Vietnam War, and what you need is a free society of profit making in which this or that government investment, they always call expenditure investment, might be helpful for finding cures, but you got to have the enterprise there, and that's actually being shown in the present case. There are over 200 companies or consortiums of nonprofit institutions like universities with companies trying to develop treatments and vaccines for COVID-19. The model here should be South Korea, which did the lockdown correctly, early, fast. I mean, look, I believe that when there's a forest fire going on, the government, or look, take my favorite example, which is if Canada invades the United States, which keeps me up at night. I mean, these Canadians are terrible. They have toques and they play hockey and so forth. It's very dangerous people. If they invade the United States, I think young men and women should be drafted by the government to go fight the damn Canadians. So even a somewhat extreme liberal like me believes in some government coercion. But what they do in South Korea is they take government money and they subcontract research to the private sector. They don't centralize the research, as alas we do in the United States, in the Centers for Disease Control, which, by the way, has a terrible intellectual environment, or the Food and Drug Administration. So central planning works for some things a little bit, but it's certainly not an all-purpose plan for solving our current problems.
Of course, our critics, would say that the free market produces duplications, waste. Why do you need 200 companies working on COVID-19?
Yeah,
Shouldn't they be coordinated? So why is it wrong?
Well,
actually,
and that's too, of course, as you understand, and I do too. That's got a silent assumption, kind of off stage, that the government doesn't involve duplication and waste and it's the assumption that the government is really good at choosing winners, and this system we have of profit-making innovation is therefore obviously inferior to this wonderful entity called the state. And any Italian knows it's implausible on its face. And any American who's paying attention knows it. If you think that sort of Sweden is a perfect society, then you might think, oh, well, but look, all we need to do is get the government to have a bunch of very nice people who've got expensive university degrees and wear expensive suits, and then we're all set. They'll do the planning. It makes more sense to, as in most other fields of human endeavor, to work bottom up. The English or the Italian language are not centrally planned. And there are no choosing of winners of vocabulary. In Italy, under fascism, they in fact attempted this without a great deal of success. Now the Italians spell the word ristorante not the same as they once did, which was French. But, you know, language, which is one of our great common inventions, is not planned. Science itself, for the most part, is not planned. Art is certainly not planned. If it's such a grand idea to have industrial policy, why not rock music policy? I actually would favor that. The extermination of rock music that sounds like airplane crashes, but you know, that's because I'm old. We wouldn't want art to be planned. Well, why do we want the art of innovation to be planned? There'll be duplication in painting or music or science, sure. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have an open society in which everyone can have a go, has permission to have a go.
Thank you very much.
It's been fun. Arrivederci.
Okay, Lorenzo. Well, okay. I hope it works now out of the interviews we listened to before. We got a few questions and we're running out of time because we're supposed to be closing around 3:30. So I'd like to go through these questions and later on, perhaps I'll give you a couple of slides more if we have enough time. So the first question was about drastic inequalities, which are actually, according to the student, the one who asked the question, a mark of contemporary capitalism. Well, if you look at the world, inequalities have been declining, roughly speaking, since the year 2000. This number of scholars of inequalities, an important one is Branko Milanovic, have been reporting about it. Considering inequalities, you know, there are always two very different levels. One is within the boundaries of a country, and one is internationally. Clearly, the most relevant inequalities are between people who unfortunately were born in a country which is poorer, and people who are instead born in a country which is richer. The inequality between these two is far more relevant than the inequality between the son of the barber and the son of the businessman within the same country. So in a sense, the important thing is for more and more countries to become richer. to have more economic growth. And that's the only thing that could help in making lives more bearable all around the world. We actually have been doing fairly well in this regard in the last, I would say, 40 years, particularly because lots of people in Asia have moved up the social ladder, and clearly, I mean, the extent which extreme poverty has been eradicated in those countries is staggering. It's very interesting. Of course, that's not true when it comes to many African countries, many sub-Saharan African countries. And clearly, the situation today is strongly affected by the pandemic. One very simple rule of thumb: it is easier for a country to get out of extreme poverty if that country is part of global trade, of international commerce. But of course, for example, in the world we're living in after COVID-19, the global demand for clothes is dropping. Clearly, the global demands of cotton is dropping in turn. And unfortunately, cotton is exported by rather poor countries, and clearly this is going to be having an effect on them. So, in a sense, the real challenge is to include this country in capitalism, in global capitalism, and give them as much as possible. Another question is about capitalism lacking the human dimension. Do I agree? Well, I don't. I think, first of all, human beings are different. They have different hopes. They have different ideas. They search for meaning in different ways. Very often, particularly as scholars or intellectuals, well, we tend to assume that the meaningful life, the only truly meaningful life, is ours. Is a life spent around books and listening to 15th century music, and so on and so forth. I don't think so. I think everybody has their own way of searching for meaning in life. Working is certainly an important source of meaning for people. I think there is a tremendous human dimension in the efforts of the small businessman who is striving to find, a spot under the sun, as we say in Italian, for herself in this world. I think there is a great human dimension for people that are struggling through their lives, and they try to improve their lot and the lot of their family by entrepreneurship. We do have a very bizarre view of who are economic actors or who are businessmen if we think that, businessmen are only the Jeff Bezos or the Bill Gates or the Sergio Motti of this world. No, I mean, the world is full of businessmen, lots of them innovating day after day, all of them trying to improve their own situation by serving their customers. And I think, this is something that requires lots of values, prudence, courage, hope, lots of determination. There's a way in which some people find meaning for themselves. When it comes to capitalism as a system, or a market economy as a system, well, its virtue and its scope is basically allocating resources in a society in a way in which it bears most fruits. The gist of the process is in creating wealth. Now, not everybody's Uncle Scrooge. I mean, you do not necessarily find happiness in wealth or in having a slightly higher income this year and last year, and so on and so forth. Lots of people search for meaning, in different things. But it is quite easier to search for meaning in different things if your belly is full. You need a certain amount of economic prosperity to search for meaning in philosophy, music, art, because if you don't have that level of economic prosperity, you're going to be struggling literally to put together your meals. Another question is, why do you think the world failed to foresee the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic and innovate the countermeasures quickly? Now, this is really a very interesting and smart question. I think it's well beyond my reach. Unexpected events happen. Clearly, we know that in the modern world, which is more interconnected than the world used to be in the past, you do have, so to say, propitious circumstances for the circulation of viruses and for the development of, alas, a pandemic situation. The world has tackled with it in very different ways. Some countries in Asia have been apparently very efficient in flattening the curve and controlling the contagion. Other countries have been really far less efficient. I think it's really too early to have a clear picture of what happened everywhere. I mean, in some countries, basically numbers have been much better because the contagion wasn't so extended as it was, for example, in the north of Italy, where I live and where IULM University is based, where unfortunately the death toll was very high and dramatic. We need to wait. At a certain point, we will have to compare the different responses by different countries, the way in which they were capable in using technologies and new devices in coping with the pandemic. Interestingly enough, all countries seem to have problems with tracing people who contracted the virus with an app. But of course, some countries put together a more traditional, very efficient system of track and tracing. It will be extremely interesting for scholars from a variety of different disciplines and fields of study in the next few years to work on this matter and try to understand what worked and what didn't. Certainly, as Matt Ridley said with a far higher authority than me before, it is quite disheartening that we see that innovation in the world of vaccines is not what we hope. There are lots of reasons for that. Clearly, the one that Matt pointed out are paramount, lack of investment, but also I think the great challenge that the world is tackling with these days is how to improve regulation so as to make vaccine development faster, but not unsafe. Also on that front, I think we'll see in the next few months what will happen. Do you think that just mere replacing the word capitalism with innovism will dispel all the ills and demerits of capitalism? Well, of course, I mean, you're absolutely entitled to your views about the ills and demerits of capitalism. I think we've seen with Professor McCloskey and before the dramatic betterment of the material condition in the so-called First World, but happily in recent time also in other countries, which was due to a society in which innovation bottom-up was empowered. This is what we can see, and of course, any human society has problems. There is no human society which perfectly fits our definition of justice or meritocracy or whatever. Still, you know, with all the imperfections, I think you have no other instance in history of societies that were capable of producing resources, wealth, and opportunity for a larger and growing number of people. And that was done by empowering innovation bottom up, by a growing division of labor internationally, and not by picking winners, not by substituting, so to say, central planning for decentralized decision making on the part of consumers and entrepreneurs. My message, or this lecture in a nutshell, is that this process, this historical phenomenon, has to be seen, has to be understood as by and large serendipitous, bottom-up, unpredictable, and made by decisions taken day after day by entrepreneurs of different kinds and by customers. There is no magic stick by which you can transform certain factors of production into what is needed for successful innovation. It's a long process of trial and error. And it is a process, I'd like to close with the key insight from Professor McCloskey's work. That was possible basically because at a certain point in history, people felt freer to experiment and felt honorable in experimenting in the economic life, whereas before the economic realm was understood as trivial, as dishonorable, as a matter that had little interest beyond, basically producing foodstuff. We see that the world we live in is improved day after day by a tremendous amount of innovation. And this innovation is due to the flexibility and the adaptability of businesses, and due to the courage, entrepreneurship of people, and by their ability to correct their mistake based upon signals that they can read from customers. So innovation is not something that you can forecast in advance. It's not something that you can plan. Is basically the result of a by and large serendipitous and bottom-up process, which is possible because of the freedom people enjoy to choose in the marketplace, and the freedom people enjoy to propose themselves as potential producers of this or that. Science is important. Modern science is clearly very important, but it's not enough, because when you got modern science and central planning, as we've seen, you typically got grand project, spectacular successes. the Leica dog up in space, but creativity, inventiveness, and new ideas were not put at the service of consumers, which means at the service of the all of us. With this, if there are not questions on Teams by people that can ask questions speaking, I don't know if we can somehow figure it out. Okay, if there are not other questions, I will basically close this conversation. Thank you very much for your attention, and now you're soon up to a clearly more interesting lecture with Professor Romenti.
Thank you, Professor. So, guys, as always, we see you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
As always, we see you in 20 minutes. We are gonna start with Professor Romenti at 4 p.m. Thank you.
Okay, we can start because it's 4 p.m. o'clock, so we are on time. Welcome to everybody. Thank you very much to be here. I am Stefania Romenti, and I am professor of strategic communication at IULM University in Milan, and I am adjunct professor of communication intangibles and communication measurement at IE Business School in Madrid. So I am director of the first master program in strategic communication in Italy, which is entirely in English. So we have students from all over the world, and I am founder and director of the research center in strategic communication at IULM University. In our research center, we manage strategic communication plans with companies. So we help companies to project and to plan communication processes and to solve their strategic communication problems. So to find some solutions. So that's the reason why today we will talk about the topic on which I make my research and that I teach. Which is the strategic communication, and we will try to understand the role of strategic communication during the pandemia, because as we know, COVID-19 continues to threaten the health of millions of people worldwide, and it continues to significantly impact businesses, and has led many corporate leaders to shift their priorities in the last months, for instance, to revisit the corporate purpose of their businesses and to work to be part of the solution in this area. So this means focusing on strategic communication and on the role of communication in this new normal. We will discuss about this topic together with some guests. So I wanted to introduce Sorry, but okay. So first of all, Marco Bardus, who is a professor of risk and health communication at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. Welcome, Marco.
Thank you. I was muting myself, so thank you very much for having me. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you to you to be here, because we know that in Beirut the situation is very critical at the moment. We have read newspapers, so thank you so much, because we know that it is not easy to be here for you. Thank you. Then I wanted to introduce Professor Manuel Chavez from the Michigan State University. Manuel is very expert of crisis communication, so he will talk about the absence, so not the role, but the absence of strategic communication in the United States. Welcome, Manuel. Manuel? Can you listen to me?
Hear me now? Yeah.
Okay, so welcome. Thank you to be here, Manuel.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Okay. And finally, unfortunately, we don't have the opportunity to meet, even if virtually, Professor Angeles Moreno, because she was not, for her, she was not possible to be here today, but she sent us a pre-recorded video. She teaches strategic communication and public relations at the University Rey Juan Carlos in Madrid, and she will talk about a European project about the communication among people, above all millennials, about COVID. So the trust of people towards some kinds of sources of information. Okay, so before starting with the speeches of our guests, I want just to share with you some very basics and some very basic concepts and key concepts about strategic communication, because I think that it is very important to share the definition of strategic communication and to be conscious of what is strategic communication, and because why strategic communication is becoming so important in the world. So strategic communication, in our opinion, is the practice of deliberate and purposive communication. A communication agent enacts in the public sphere on behalf of a communicative entity to reach set goals. The ultimate aim of strategic communication is to maintain a healthy reputation for the communicative entity in the public sphere, and strategic communication is said to examine how organizations use communication purposefully to fulfill their mission. So, as you can see, strategic communication is deliberate and is purposive. It has set goals. So, typically, a strategic communication process is a communication process that follows from an organization's strategic plan. So, it is focused on the role of communication to enable strategic goals and objectives. So today we will talk about crisis communication, risk communication, health communication, but remember that not all crisis, health, or risk communication is strategic. When we talk about communicative entities, we organizations, we can mean a broad spectrum of business and social and economic actors. So not only business companies, because strategic communication could be very useful also for NGOs, for not-for-profit organizations, for politicians, for activists, for government agencies. So every kind of institution, organizations, or also person or a brand can use strategic communication. So to communicate strategically means to communicate with a purpose in order to advance, for instance, an organization's mission. And to be strategic does not mean to be manipulative or to be propagandistic at all, to hide the reality or to tell lies in order to reach the goals. But you can be strategic and reach your goals by being collaborative, by being inclusive or dialogic. So that is very, very important. Another key concept for defining strategic communication, in our opinion, is the concept of public sphere. So just to in order to be able to project effective plans of strategic communication, you have always to contextualize your communication projects in the public sphere. So the public sphere is a sort of the mirror of what happens in society. And what is important to understand is that public sphere is not dominated by people, but it is dominated by topics, by arguments in the ring. So as you can see from, for instance, in the first figure, you can see some black points. These are contents, these are topics, such as the COVID, such as the swine flu, for instance, brands, for instance, some topic issues. And you can see that society, private organizations, media organizations, but also people, such as different speakers, for instance, representatives of organizations, advocates, experts, scientists, intellectuals, journalists can discuss about these topics. So the public sphere, as you can see from the figure C, is a network of points of interest. And something such as a brand, a person, or a specific topic in the public sphere is in the public sphere because it is discussed, because it is communicated. So a strategic communication plan is strategic when it is contextualized within the public sphere. Okay, that's very important also for the COVID-19, for the pandemia, and for the topics which are related to the pandemia. So now I want to invite the first guest to to make his presentation. So I invite Marco to share his presentation. And I want just to add that our presentations will last just more or less 1 hour. So we will end around 5 o'clock, and then we will have time to answer to your questions if you want to ask us some questions. And if you want to ask questions during the presentation, you can write down them in the chat, and I will try to read them and to forward them to our speakers. So thank you for attention, and I leave the floor to Marco.
Okay, can you hear me well? Yeah. Yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Stefania, for the introduction. And thank you for having me today to talk about risk communication and community engagement, so the perspective that we can use in the COVID-19 pandemic. As you mentioned very well now, so risk communication is probably can fit in different fields of communication studies. So what I propose here today is a reflection on what risk communication is. So with some definition on concepts, on frameworks used in risk communication. And then we're going to talk about risk communication and community engagement as a framework used in COVID-19 pandemic in different parts of the world. I'll try to give you some reflection on what I believe, of course, this is my opinion, what works and what didn't work, what did work and what didn't work and where it worked. At the same time, I want to also end up with a few recommendations for the future. Now, let's start talk about risk communication itself. So risk communication is a discipline that probably started about 20 years ago to become, let's say, to pick up attention, let's say, from communication scholars in the world. And as you can see I have provided here a list of definitions of risk communication, mostly come from the United States. And here is the definition from the United States Department of Health and Human Services. Around 2002, they provided this definition of risk communication as an interactive process of exchange of information and opinion among individuals, groups, and institutions, which involves the dissemination of individual and population health risk information. Now, as you can see, the focus is very much on health risk, right? And this also is consistent with the definition that the CDC in 2013 provided. CDC is the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. So risk communication is an approach that provides a combination between risk and emergency approaches to prepare for, respond, and recover from epidemics and outbreaks, and etc. However, I want to stress also now some aspects that are going beyond the health aspect, which is the topic of today, which is the definition provided by the WHO, the World Health Organization. So here we talk about threat, so real-time exchange of information, advice and opinions between experts, talking about a threat that is important for the survival, health, economic, and social well-being. So the definition of WHO is a bit more broader, goes beyond the definition of health or health-related outcomes, if you want to say. So it's about the discussion of risk and this informed decision-making process. As you can see also, the application of risk communication has spanned over the years on many different aspects, the environmental risks and threats. We talk about waste disposal, the overpopulation related to smog, air pollution, water pollution, wildfires, or problems related to more societal aspects, related to diseases, the diffusion of disease and hunger, and pandemics, of course, at the same time also on man-made problems such as terrorism, which have impact on immediate loss of lives, of course, and long-term in terms of mental health, and in terms of fear, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and some other mental health problems. Now, risk communication is a strategic approach. So here I think it fits well into the definition of strategic communication that we provided before. So it's a planned and a coordinated effort based on appropriate choice of channels, which provide clear, timely, accurate, and audience-specific messages from credible sources. We'll go back to these concepts in a few moments. But I think I want us to stress these aspects here. So it's an appropriate choice of channels, providing clear, timely, accurate, audience-specific messages from credible sources. And this comes from a strategic, reflective approach based on data analysis and segmentation of the target population and so on. So if we want to see, risk communication is a combination of three main areas. So we have risk assessment on one side, which is science-based, based on analysis of data. Risk management, which is the policy orientation, how governments as organizations and institutions can deal with and cope with crisis, and how can they minimize the risks. And then there's the risk communication, which is the interactive exchange of information and opinion concerning risk. From a communication and behavioral sense standpoint, the research and risk communication has discussed or focused on different areas. One is the risk perception, which is related to how people, the public opinion, perceive the risks. Theories on process information, extended power process model, protection motivation theory, and so many others, mostly from health sciences, from health psychology, if you want to say. Then there's also related to the cognitive response to disasters and emergencies. There are aspects related to fear appeals, how we process information related to fear, to emotion, emotion communication, persuasion, of course. Most of the communication needs to persuade someone to wear a mask, in public, or when specific spaces are available. And of course, a lot of research has been done on the media effect, the source of information and mass communication, how this can influence public opinion. Now, we spoke a lot about risk, and then we spoke about the risk perception. And as you can see from this graph here, the actual risk, so let's say the cause of death for a heat wave or road traffic accident is much higher than the perception of the risk. When think about if you have a terrorist attack or airplane crash, everybody talks about it, so we think that this risk is much higher than what it is. And this is also related to COVID-19. So if we want to compare it to the risk of catching a flu, a seasonal flu, compared to COVID-19, we can clearly see from this graph here that the risk is different. So we cannot say COVID-19 is just a seasonal flu. It's much worse than that. Okay, so if we look at all ages graph, we have about 12 to 24 times higher chances of catching the COVID-19 compared to seasonal flu. And people that are aged 60 plus, or 60 years older, have much higher chances of getting severe consequences of this disease. Now, at the same time, compared to the R0, so which is the number that is considered the benchmark for transmissible diseases, is the number of people that you can infect once you get the disease. So COVID-19, according to the data that we have so far, is about between 2 and 2.5, whereas regular flu, the seasonal flu, is about 1.3. The incubation time is also varied, it's different, and the hospitalization rate is much higher in COVID-19. And the case fatality rates, the number of people that are dying among the total cases, is almost like 3 to 4 times higher. So this is just to give a comparison. However, this doesn't mean that it's the highest case of death in the world. Of course, there are many other things that we are underestimating because we are focusing too much probably on COVID-19. So there are consequences of the COVID-19 in terms of communicable disease and non-communicable diseases that the public opinion is not paying attention to, but they will probably soon realize. For example, people are not going to the hospital to treat their own chronic conditions, and this will have an impact, dramatic impact in the future. So in the terms of, when talk about risk, yes.
Marco, can I just interrupt you? Can I ask you to go just to speak just a bit slower, because you are showing a very interesting charts and graphs. So you are very quick. So it's thank you.
I'm keeping my phone with me so that I can cover everything in 20 minutes. But anyway, I will lower speed down anyway. So I wanted to go back to the concept of health risk. So in terms of risk assessment, we talked about perception of risk. And generally speaking, it's a subjective likelihood or probability that we are going to be experiencing some condition, in this case, COVID-19. So what's the probability that if I go out on the streets now, I can catch the virus? So I'll assess the risk and say, okay, if I go to the supermarket, I might be more likely to get the risk. So if it's risky, I will not put a mask, for example, or I will wear the mask because I think that I have more probability, more chances to get the risk of getting the virus. Now, is this acceptable? For example, so I'm saying, okay, I'm more at risk, but I am healthy, I am young, so I might not consider this as a risky behavior, so I might not change my behavior. And this is why sometimes we can think about why young generations of people do not wear masks. They feel that they are, superhumans. They don't think they will catch the virus, and that's therefore they don't wear masks. They don't keep physical distancing, and so on. So this can be an explanation for that. So once we accept the risk, then we make a change. We start wearing masks in public or not, and we find an alternate action. Now, all of this just to give a context to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the past 15 to 20 years, several organizations, especially the WHO, the UN agencies, and the CDC, have developed several frameworks to plan a response, to plan an activity for different problems, different risk communication, different risk issues. So the communication behavior impact was used explicitly for outbreaks. And we talk about the crisis and emergency risk communication, the CIRC, and then risk communication and community engagement is a framework applied now to COVID-19. Because my colleague later will talk about the US problem, the US perspective, I will not delve too much into the CIRC framework, but I'm going to focus mostly on the risk communication and community engagement framework later. But just to give you an idea, the CIRC, so the Crisis and Emergency Risk Communication, is a planning framework. Again, we divide the risk or the emergency in different phases. And the phases are presented in the slide. We have a preparation phase, we have an initial phase of response to the emergency. Then we have the maintenance, which is that post situation when most cases have been found in the population. Then we have the resolution when the emergency has been returned to a state of the more manageable state. Now, in the preparation phase, this is where the planning starts. So the strategic discussions should interfere. We should start being laid out in the preparation phase. In the initial phase is where a spokesperson with some specific characteristics, I'm going to talk about it later, should express empathy, explain the risks, try to minimize the perception of risk among the population, and they should promote action. At the same time, they should say, this is what our team, this is what our organization, our government is doing to minimize the risk. So they have to manage the communications. In the maintenance stage, when we are in the maintenance stage probably now, because the COVID-19 pandemic is still running. So until we find a vaccine, we will be in this situation probably. This is when organizations such as governments worldwide should explain the risks, should explain, continue, maintain the information flow with the different publics, with the media, and with the citizens, trying to explain and understand why we are in this situation, how we reached this point. Of course, different messages should appeal to different audiences. That's why here you see segment audiences. It's a very important aspect. I'll talk about segmentation in marketing, but it's a fundamental concept here. And last point, but is very important, the address rumors. Think about the fake news that are circulating, the conspiracy theories that are circulating on social media, and not only on social media. So this is where a government should say, no, this is not true, this is fake. They should address them, and they should explain why they are fake, why they're not true. And of course, once the pandemic will be over, we will reflect on this experience, we'll try to understand what worked and what didn't work, and we would revise the plan. But again, this is more likely the idea behind the CIRC rhythm. It's just been introduced around 2002 in the United States by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Now, these are the main principles, the 6 principles of CIRC. The first, you need to provide rapid information, be accurate, of course, be right, provide accurate and credible information. And you need to express empathy. You need to show respect to the population that are, probably scared about the situation. They don't know about it. They don't know how to act, so they need someone to guide. They need good leaders. And the messages should be action-oriented, so they promote action. They say, this is what you need to do. This is a way to minimize the risk, the perception, and the fear that might come from uncertainty. I'll go back to that in a few moments. Now, within the context of risk communication, this framework, the risk communication and community engagement, comes into play. Why is this important? Because from the previous pandemics also, risk communication and community engagement has shown to be effective in maintaining the situation and control it in an acceptable way. So community engagement strategies are employed along with the risk management, risk analysis, in order to provide surveillance and active interventions to different levels of the population. And so this is, I mean, I'll leave you the slides for later. I just wanted to highlight a few points here. So RCCE as a framework to effectively communicate with populations in order to maintain trust, increase reputation. That's what also Stefania was mentioning before, from the viewpoint of the governments, of course, maintain a reputation in order to reduce the economic impact, the social impact, and of course, health impact, which is the loss of life in this case. It's the most important aspect. Again, risk communication and community engagement is a strategic framework to address the infodemic that we are facing. So we are not new to this, and it's a way to address the problem of the overload of information that is coming from different sources. So the idea is behind this, we need to have a streamlined approach that allows people to understand where to find this information. I know that the colleague from Spain will talk about the sources of information related to COVID-19 at the end of this session. So when we talk about risk, in this case, about different communities, we have different segments. So we have people that are more at risk because they are young, because they are alone, because they are, they're older. They might be of specific ethnic and racial groups, and this is exactly what's going on, especially in some parts of South America or in Asia. So the crisis is hitting special segments of the population who cannot, for example, stay at home. They cannot afford to stay at home because they need to work. Now, there is also an element related to those who are, they have limited social capital, those who have not been in good communities, they're not supported by communities, they cannot afford to be with other groups, and they are left isolated in this case. In the same time, some communities do not have the skills and the capacities to act in ways that would help them to overcome the problem. Think about the elderly; they might not have access to social media, for example. If the communication is relying on those channels, we will not be able to reach them. And this again is about giving the context. We're looking at COVID-19. So the RCCE, they developed different. So the interagency, WHO, and other UN, United Nations agencies have developed strategic plans, as you can see from the slide. These are available online, of course. A preparedness response guidance, and then the global response strategy, which highlights what are the steps needed in order to provide governments and organizations with the tools to start a response here. And they provide also a tool to classify the risk, the exposure to COVID-19, depending on the capacity and the preparedness of a country in this context. So and this is the situation in February 2020, so almost the beginning of the pandemic. As you can see, China was in the community transmission phase, so the virus was circulating widely in the community. However, China was classified as in level 5 of being very well prepared. They have been going through other pandemics before, or other epidemics, SARS and MERS, for example. MERS also was present in the Middle East. So those countries were considered prepared, all right? The situation is, in June 2020, a bit more dramatically changed. So I can see there's many more countries are in the community transmission quadrant here. And Italy, for example, United States are in level 5, considered prepared in terms of capacity. So they have the capacity to deal with this problem, but have they dealt with the problem efficiently and effectively? I'm not really sure. So just to give an idea. So what worked and what didn't work? Here I give you four or five problems that I think were issues in the way this pandemic has been dealt with. So first of all, they should sell. So we're talking about a novel coronavirus. So the scientific community is still learning about it, and there are still many questions that have not been answered. So we're working in the context of extreme uncertainty. And this, of course, doesn't play well in terms of communication. There are ways we can deal with uncertainty. At the same time, this might lead to messages that are not consistent. This goes to the second problem. Besides the problem, is it a big problem? Is it a small problem? Is it like the flu or is it not like the flu? So you heard about these messages long and time, more than once. Of course, I'm not the one saying them. And of course, you have there's different problems that are dealt in different ways in different countries. So this has created a problem of consistency. At the same time, the root causes of the problem are not clear, but they might be due to bigger problems that we cannot solve easily by wearing a mask, for example, or by keeping our physical distance. So maybe some of you have seen this cartoon before. So you see the wave of the COVID-19 is basically going to smash a city in Canada. Be sure you wash your hands and you will be fine. Wash your hands, stay home, no problem. We'll go through the lockdown together. And then there's a bigger wave of the recession coming after the COVID-19. And some people have also put another wave. This is a climate change due to the fact that we stay more home and then we cannot travel. At the same time, we consume more energy, we consume more things. And then there's also a bigger wave due to the potential biodiversity collapse looming in the background. So this is just to give you an idea of what could be, not to give a pessimistic overlook at the future, but at the same time to give an idea of the perspective of what a pandemic has created globally, that can be done globally. Now, I give you, of course, I am in Beirut, and just give you a context related to the fact that sometimes crises come in different pieces, and they're not the only thing that can happen. Of course, this is the blast that happened a month ago about it created a loss, loss of lives, a lot of economic problematics there, but the crises that Lebanon is suffering are far from being only related to the explosion. The COVID-19 cases have been on the rise 2 weeks prior to the explosion. There's been a hyperinflation and depreciation of the Lebanese pound, and half of the population, believe me, 0.5% of the population are in the poverty line. So this is just because the COVID-19 was very lying in the background. Now it's probably the least of the problems that most of the population are facing. And here I close with this picture here on the government did this, because this is related to COVID-19, the fact that people do not trust the government. So whatever solutions is the government providing, nobody will follow them. They tried the lockdown in the last week or so. The people did not follow it. They wanted to reduce the cases because we have increased the case fatality rate by 100%, basically, and nobody's following it. So the problem is then the response has been probably mostly focused on the emergency rather than on the planning phase. So we need to deal with the emergency. We don't know what to do. We need to make decisions very quickly without focusing and reflecting on. We don't have a plan. That's what happened. And the community engagement, because we need to rush things, was very much probably one way, vertical, and bottom down. So not very much participatory and engaging as we want to do. Now, of course, there's the communication process elements, and I'm going to close it very quickly, related to the messenger. So who is the communicator who is promoting the messages? In many cases, you see that the political leadership is providing the messages to the population without the experts. But in the case of crisis and risk communication, the spokesperson should be a person that is expert in the field. In the case of the United States, and my colleague will talk about, there are experts, but they are taking a lower ground, let's say, compared to the politicians. In the middle here, we have the Prime Minister of Singapore, and here we have, on the left, we have Boris Johnson from the United Kingdom. And another case, this is like the positive side, this is New Zealand. The Prime Minister of New Zealand is always followed by an expert in the field, and they will never take over their position. So here there's an expert, here is the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Now the communication process is also unclear. Sometimes the messages are complicated or are not clear enough, not action-oriented, and create confusion. So what are we supposed to do with stay alert, control the virus, save lives, and protect the NHS. What do these messages mean for the citizens? So I think this is also a problem related to the lack of action-orientedness of the message. The last point is also about the consistency. So if we ask people to wear masks because this is important, we need to be consistent. We need to meet and show that we are doing so instead of not doing so. So if our leaders are not the role models that we are supposed to do, then how can we expect the citizens to follow? Now, last problem for me was the fact that we are using channels to promote the behaviors. At the same time, we're also facing the challenges of the infodemics. So there are fake news and conspiracy theories trying to circulate among the public, and there's not clear information flow. So there's a lack of trust, generalized lack of trust towards governments, towards institutions such as WHO, even if they have their own their expertise there. At the same time, people do not trust them. They probably rather trust their own social networks, family, friends. So that's why, Facebook or WhatsApp are very potential channels for misinformation in this case. So my recommendations are, very briefly, for the future. So we need really to reflect on the COVID-19 pandemic and reflect and prepare for the future. We need to make plans, and especially long-term risk communication and community engagement strategies to reach vulnerable segments of the population in an equitable and inclusive way, because we cannot expect that everyone would react to the same message the same way. Health system, of course, needs to adapt and to be prepared for new challenges, because COVID-19 is not the first pandemic and it's not going to be the last one, unfortunately. So we need to be prepared for bigger, major, much more virulent pandemics in the future. And of course, the main issue here is the trust. How can we build trust? How can we build and maintain trust when there is no trust? When there is lack of trust or generalized lack of trust among institutions? I think the important aspect here would be to be transparent and to be constant. So we need to have a protocol that ensures that we are upfront as governments, as strategic communicators. We need to tell, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, and we need to be transparent in that sense. We don't need to hide information that might create some problems later on. I'm going to close here. I don't want to go much on more details on that. And I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the questions later on.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Marco. It was a very rich presentation, so full of concepts and examples, very inspiring. Thank you so much. I don't know if I think that we can leave this space and time for questions at the end of our seminar. So now, if you agree, I leave the floor to Manuel. Please, Manuel. Can you share your presentation, or do you need help?
I think so. Can you see it?
Okay, yes, we see it.
Okay. Would control the computer using... Okay. If you can see it, let me open this and go to my PowerPoint and start.
Probably view.
Probably view, right?
Yes. So you are slideshow.
Slideshow. Okay.
Slideshow, probably, yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you very much again for the invitation, Stefania, and this couldn't be more appropriate for a group of students and experts to talk about a crisis communication and a strategic communication. As you see in my title, and I'm very pleased that I'm following Marco, because he talked about what it should be, what it has to be, what it must be, what the government needs to pay attention, particularly in something as important as a pandemic. And well, I'm going to show you a case study in the case of the United States where nothing in terms of strategic communication has worked. And the title actually reflects that. There is an absence of strategic communication. So let me go to the first slide. As Marco was mentioning, communication is highly dynamic, particularly during a health crisis. And it's a real public social challenge that I would argue that is extremely, extremely politicized. Every time that I talk to my colleagues who work and do research on crisis communication, they are puzzled, completely puzzled by the fact of what has happened in the United States and in other countries as to how political figures have dominated the messages that goes to the public, and how political interests have diminished the importance of health officials and scientific teams. So I think that most of us, we understood that in a crisis, strategic communication play a critical role, and we have helped organizations. I was working for the federal government of the United States, as a matter of fact, helping in some of the protocols in terms of crisis that need to be followed when something like a pandemic or something like a major health problem is in the country. However, the political variable is something that we knew that existed, but we didn't know how poisoning it was to completely erosion not only the essence of the strategic communication, but also the trust of the organizations that precisely Marco was talking about. So scientific standards in the United States have been facing a challenge and a struggle with the politics. And unfortunately, in the United States, the person that has been leading the political distrust and the political confusion has been the President of the United States, which is extremely, extremely dangerous. And the third component is the news media reality. And of course, Marco mentioned it as well. All of us, we know that now the news media is what? It's segmented. It's segmented, and there is something called the confirmation bias and the political bias that most people tend to follow specific sources of information about the that fits their ideology. In the United States, for instance, there is obviously conservative networks, let's say central networks that are practicing pure journalism, and there is other networks that are on the left. So we have networks on the right, networks on the center, and networks on the left. And the problem is that people start looking into their specific sources, and sometimes those sources are replicating the information that feeds the ideological platform that they have in the newsroom. This is something that when Stefania, when Marco, a year ago, if they would tell us, if somebody would ask us, is there a chance that the political scenarios would dominate strategic communication, would say, well, maybe, but not in a real crisis like a pandemic. Well, now we need to calibrate our models because the political influence is literally destroying any model in strategic communication. So here is the situation. Who is doing the strategic communication? Here is the question. Who is leading it? Dr. Fauci, who is the director of the Institute for Infectious Diseases in the Institute of Health, who is the real authority in epidemiological issues in not only the United States, in the world, for God's sakes. And he has been literally muted by the political system. It started with the president, and then now followed by the vice president. Dr. Birch, who is the other person that is the coordinator, who was a student of Dr. Fauci, no, their voices are completely muted by the political institutions, not political institutions, but by the political figures. The experts and sometimes the public have different views, and here is where I combine the element in which the message has been coming out, then the media selectively puts that content in the face of the public, and the public is completely at odds with the message because not too many people are understanding what exactly is going on. I have talked to we have been conducting surveys in the United States, and something that we discovered is that people who are following the conservative networks like Fox News are more resistant to follow any kind of medical advice because that channel and that network has been promoting and disseminating the wrong message, okay? And when we ask people that watch other news organizations, they are actually more in tune with the analysis that is important into the face of the pandemic. So we can see that there is a serious difference between those who watch certain networks that are conservative versus some other people that watch networks that are more liberal or progressive. So what we discover also, and of course Professor Romenti knows this, is the fact that the goals of political communication are in completely collusion with the goals of health communication. The goals of health communication are relegated to something else because the goals of political communication are competing, and then strategic communication is the last one because it doesn't fit necessarily with the political communication, the health communication, and the strategic communication. This is something that eventually, when we talk about the public sphere, we're going to need to model this one. So I think, Stefania, that we are going to, this pandemic, unfortunately, but fortunately, is bad because it's happening and a lot of people are being dead. But for us, it's going to be golden in developing new approaches into which there is a need to sort of neutralize, in part, the notion of the goals of political communication. Also, one important thing is that terms are difficult to understand. Sometimes Dr. Fauci, he talks very scientifically about the pandemic, and he talks about immunosense. He talks about T cells versus B cells, cytokines and mycotines, and so forth, and people don't understand that, and that is a serious problem. So some of the lessons that we are getting into the United States, which have not necessarily well practiced, is precisely that the information that goes into the public, it's a priority for the federal government, for the national government. And the state agencies, in the United States, we have 50 states. Each state also needs to implement its own measures for the control of the pandemic. But as I put in there, the mission is to get accurate, understandable information to the public in a timely manner so people can take action to save lives and minimize damage to property. Well, that has not happened. And part of it is because the message has not very clear. Let me point in the lower photo that I have there. You see that in the photo where President Trump is standing, he is not wearing a mask. And the person that is in the microphone is the director of the federal agency that authorizes medications. And he is not wearing a mask. And the two physicians, the two doctors that are on the side, Dr. Fauci on the right and Dr. Birch in the left, the two of them are wearing masks. Also is the director of the Institute for Health. But you see that the president is sending the wrong message immediately with some of his officials. Something that we have here in the United States is something called the American Joint Information Center. This is another thing that it didn't work. The American Joint Information Center was created and refined after September 11. The purpose of it is to inform the public. If you see the center of the slide, it says, speaking with one voice. Other levels of government at the local level, executive agencies like law enforcement, and of course, people who are on the scene like physicians, medical experts. This was developed in order to synchronize the information that it's supposed to be provided to the public. Well, it didn't work, and it's not working still now. In Michigan, that was at some point, I live in the state of Michigan in the Midwest. It's one of the states that had at the beginning very high number of cases following New York and California. Our governor is a governor that is a Democrat who is in the different political party of the president of the United States, who is a Republican. What we notice is that the information that was coming from the federal government was different from the information that was coming from the governor. And then another important thing, sometimes in the cities, some of the mayors are conservative or they might be liberal. And in that particular case, the information again was completely different. So this notion that is a piece, a central piece in strategic communication in the case of a crisis, speaking with one voice, didn't work and is not working now. The number three, and is the connection with the news media. As I was telling you before, the media was in the United States, and of course in other countries, you have newsrooms and you have the media that has certain ideological leanings, and that doesn't help to maintain a common message for all people, because people do selection and go into choosing those networks that fit their own ideology. So here in the third party, something that we need to work a lot. How do we, in the case of emergencies, in the case of crisis, in the case of major pandemics like the one that we see, we work with the news media in which they reduce their ideological components to really pass information to the public that is useful and that is based on science. Journalists need to think about what is the ultimate goal of reporting a health crisis. And that is one of the most important issues. And again, we have seen that that's not the case, and there is variations between different networks. Secondly, who is the expert? Who are going to have in our panels, in our news segments, informing the public about what is what should be the actions to be taken in the pandemic? Well, again, here is a lot of variation. You find that conservative networks didn't have public health officials. What they have, it was political appointees or political elected officials who were the experts on health issues. Number three, and this is something very important, the role of the news media, and of course, Stefania knows my bias with the news media because I work directly with journalism. And I think that one of the roles of journalists and the news media is to inform the public in what it should be expected from the government. In other words, the role of the media is to be a watchdog. A watchdog. Is an institution that is looking at the government to pinpoint when they are not doing the right thing. That's the function of the government, because it's the function of the news media, because it's supposed to inform the public. And I can tell you that with some exceptions, the news media have failed that. Protect themselves, yes. I have seen some of the interviews, I have seen some of the networks going and interview places where they were doing the testing without being completely covered, not wearing a mask, and they were probably exposing themselves into a problem. So here the media is essentially very critical. And and this is something that I don't think that I need to underline, because all of us, we know it, because journalists are the first responders. They are the first ones in going to places, in going to report about what's going on, in trying to get the sense of how doctors in hospitals are dealing with emergencies. And of course, they need to express empathy. They need to clarify the facts about what is known, what is not known, and explain the steps that the officials are taking, and call those officials who are not informing properly but follow the advice of the health officials. By the way, that picture that is in the bottom, it's a photo that from one of the hospitals, one of the interviews that we're doing in Bergamo during the pandemic, and you can see that the doctors were on one side and the camera were on the other side, trying to explain what was happening. Because if you remember, that part of northern Italy was one of the centers for the explosion of the pandemic in Italy. So at least I'm happy to see that the Italian reporters were doing the right thing. But That was not the case here in the United States. So what is ultimately the notion of a crisis emergency, crisis communication in risk and emergency context? Well, the principles that we know, that we work on it, that we study in terms of having protocols as be the first source of information, didn't happen in the United States with health officials, only the beginning. But then when the president didn't like the information that Dr. Fauci was providing, then the situation was all confusing. It's important to express empathy early, right away, understanding that people needed to, some people might be exposed to the infection and perhaps face major medical challenges, and understanding that. And of course, the consequences of what this is going to bring. They need to show competence and expertise. In other words, health officials have to have the main voice, and this didn't happen in the United States. Remain honest and open. Well, Dr. Fauci was very honest and open at the beginning. He said, there is going to be almost 200,000 people dead in the United States. And I checked today, we have 186,000. So we're very close to the 200,000. So we will. But President Trump was very upset with him because he said that 200,000 people, 200,000 Americans would die. And I think that at some point we're going to need to create some sort of legislation that doesn't allow politicians to block the information coming from medical experts. So that is something that is going to be our task in the future for all of us that we work in strategic communication. And of course, commitment and remain dedicated, which is what, in the case of the United States, from the National Institute of Health and the Institute of Infectious Diseases, they are doing. But the strategy, the concepts, the protocols of the principles of risk communication for public emergency officials failed completely in the United States. In other words, no strategic communication was followed, no cohesive message was provided, and it's making us rethink how the different pieces that are included in pandemics came to complicate everything. The last one is like, if you have time, all of our dear friends who are listening to this wonderful idea of talking about the pandemic and communication, go to the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University. It is open to everybody, and this provides what is the outbreak communication. Outbreak meaning at the time that we were seeing the explosion of the cases in Italy, in Spain, in the United States, and how we need to make sure that everything informs practically with the same message. This is a very interesting concept that we should be exploring more about how to create those institutions with a cohesive message. And with that, I don't want to take more time. I would like to stop in there and then looking forward for the questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Manuel. Very rich presentation. So we have received some questions. So if you agree, I would like to ask to answer to these questions in order to leave the opportunity to have just a bit of discussion, to with people who are listening to us, and then tomorrow the organizers will share the video, the pre-recorded video by Angles Moreno. So if you agree, I would prefer to discuss a bit more and to answer to this question, because it's 5 o'clock, so we are just in late. Okay, so there is a question, I think, for Manuel, because this person says or writes, political influence is destroying the strategic communication, or this specific political influence is detrimental and not politics in itself, to not attack social democracy but current state of affairs. What do you think about it, Manuel?
Wow. That is precisely what I have been trying to disentangle and decipher. To what level is the political ideology shaping the message? In the United States, I can tell you that it is. It is the political message that is shaping what Americans we should think about the pandemic. It's not succeeding because, on the other hand, we have the strategic communication followed by health officials who are telling us, no, you need to follow the clinical and the medical advice, not necessarily the political. I think that political ideology is always going to be in any crisis, because remember, in any crisis, there will be people at the top that are responsible, and they're going to try to massage the message in order to make sure that the institutions are not damaged. In the case of the United States, the messages have been reshaped to protect the re-election of President Trump. So, because remember, our elections are in November. It's only 2 months from now, 2 months and a half from now. And he is shaping the message on the basis of his political interest, not necessarily on the basis of the public interest. And that is a big challenge. That is something that, oh my God, that's going to be my next article.
Thank you, Manuel. So, Marco, a question for you. Is it lack of strategic communication or failure of strategic leadership? Firstly, to neglect it. Secondly, trying to cover up. And finally, ending up eventually with mess up.
That's a good point. That's a good question. I think, we need to be careful also in comparing. My presentation was a bit general. I did not focus on specific countries. I think that makes the context needs to be made. I can talk about the situation here in Lebanon. So there's no, for COVID-19, there's the Minister of Public Health speaking. So again, a political figure who was representing a specific sectarian aspect of the society. He's not speaking as a independent person, let's say, in a sense. However, there are no strategic plans. So the lack of strategic planning, I think it is a major issue, first of all. Then there might be a cover-up, and this creates the lack of strategy. So it increases the problem of, let's say, a lack of strategies already being there. So you overlap problems over one on the other. So there's a lack of trust that is incentivized by the fact that the government is trying to hide or to minimize the loss or the numbers in some cases, and this is proven. This is not something I am inventing now. So there you see there are different levels. Now the last point of the question, Stefania, can you repeat? There was
firstly, neglect it. Secondly, trying to cover up, and finally, ending up eventually mess up.
Yeah, of course. If there's no plan, I think there's the big issue that you don't know how to address the problem. So, as I mentioned in my presentation, so we are trying to cope with an emergency. We try to figure out how to deal with the situation. without having a clear plan or a strategy to tell us, okay, in this situation, this is what we should do, or in an outbreak, this is what you should do. So probably, it's a problem of frameworks, perhaps. So we probably stick to frameworks that are looking at emergency, at outbreaks, a situation that are, they're not protracted crises. So we need probably to shift our attention to situations that are protracted. Countries like Lebanon can tell us, can tell the Western world, the global North, a lot about what it means to deal with protracted crisis, environmental crisis, refugee crisis, wars, and then you have, the humanitarian problems related to the blast and so on. So an economical crisis, by the way, this is all, on top of things. So protracted crises try to minimize the problem and at the same time, create different priorities. So now COVID-19, as I mentioned before, is not a priority for this population here. It's survival, mere survival. I don't have enough money to buy food. What can I do? I need to work. I cannot stay home. I cannot afford to stay home. So these are the problems that the society and not only organizations need to deal with. There's individuals, and then you have communities that have to come up together and to find a solution. So we need to probably rethink, the strategic communication applied in this context of protracted crisis. I think public health schools have or can contribute to the discourse, not only in the School of Communication. So I think,
okay. Okay, so we have so many questions, so we have to be very short in answer, just to leave space to everybody. So there is a question of $1 million. I try to answer myself, because what are the right tools for an effective strategic communication campaign in the era of fake news? And there are two questions which are similar. What are the right tools for a successful strategic communication campaigns nowadays? It's a very $1 million question, because what I can say, I think that if you adopt a strategic communication perspective, you have to consider that your publics are not markets. So you have to consider publics as people who perceive the reality in a certain manner. There are always gaps between perceptions of publics and different kinds of publics and reality. So you have to study your publics, you have to study your perceptions together with the context and so on, before selecting tools and before selecting the right channels and selecting messages. I think that there are not right tools, absolutely, but there are adequate tools for some publics, for also filling in some gaps. So I think that it is very important for strategic communicators to take this perspective and to contextualize very deeply the strategic communication plan. Then I have another question for Manuel. It transpires that the world is yet to know details of COVID. Whom do you think is responsible for this? Media or scientists or politicians?
Wow. In the case of the United States, of course, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Also in generally, yes.
Yeah, because I have seen some other models. Well, I could argue that the UK and the United States have been very close in the models of confusing the public. I think that the media has a lot of responsibility to bear. And I'm going to be one of the first ones in illustrating how certain networks did not have a public interest. So they were not informing properly the public about what they needed to do in the pandemic. So that's number one. Secondly, I think that there is a need to bring up the responsibility of public officials, politicians, who did not inform the public because they were interested in their political gains and impacting the health of the general public. So somehow there has to be a responsibility built to them to be accountable. And health officials, if you ask me, who is the most vulnerable in this model of strategic communication during the COVID-19 crisis, pandemic? I would say is the public, the health officials. Health officials have been the one that have been trapped in the middle with trying to bring information. You saw how the President of the United States was making fun of the director of the WHO. It's tragic that my president is making fun of the director of the WHO. For God's sakes, what kind of message is that?
It's cutting funding, and it's cutting funding.
Exactly right. You're right, Marco. So imagine that. So the health officials have been crippled by the political institutions. So I think that we're going to need to create a set of new benchmarks and accountability process that allowed to be the health officials that want to have the voice in a pandemic, in the next pandemic. That's for sure. Yeah.
Okay. And another question for Manuel. What would you say about on-the-ground reporting in times of crisis?
Very good reporting and very bad reporting. The New York Times, the Washington Post, BBC has been doing a magnificent job in going into the ground, talking to people, talking to the families, talking to the doctors. And the bad one is something that it was very sad, in which I saw reporting of focusing on the people who own businesses and that they have been able to open it and how much money they're going to be losing, which is important, of course. But they never went in to talk to doctors, families, and victims. One of the important things is to show that there is a human side of this. And I understand that the economy is the next step, but the first one is about the victims and their families, and that's something that the media has failed. There has been very good examples of it, but for the most part, it has not been very, very comprehensive.
Okay. We have a question also from a colleague at IULM University, Professor Galli. Do you want to open your microphone and ask your question directly?
Yes, thanks so much.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Stefania. Fantastic, and also for your guest. And the question is this, because both of you talk about absence and the lack of strategy. And the question is, do you think that absence and the lack of strategies can be interpreted like a strategy itself?
Marco, Manuel?
Thanks so much. Thanks so much again, Stefania. Super.
Who wants to answer?
I can start maybe. I wish.
Can you be quick? Can you be quick? Just because we have other questions and we have to stop.
I wish it's not the case. I wish there's really a lack of planning. I wish really there's lack of planning, because otherwise, this is not acceptable. I would not accept it from. So communication experts in the world should not be deemed responsible for the strategy of not having a strategy. Over.
I agree. I agree with Marco. I think that is the lack of it's not the absence itself, but is the lack of the instruments and the ignoring. Excuse me. Let me rephrase that. Is ignoring the actual strategies that are already in place. For us, is a complete mystery. No, it's not a mystery. It's a complete mind-boggling to see that the experts are ignoring the protocols when the protocols are there. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Thanks so much.
Nice seeing you.
And Another question is, how do we communicate effectively and fight fake news, conspiracy theories with our acquaintances on an everyday basis? Manuel.
Tackle that to Marco, or you want me to go first?
Go ahead, go ahead.
Okay, that's another 1 million question.
Yes. They are very challenging.
Exactly, that's another one question, and it's because now with social media, and of course I was talking about networks, I wasn't talking about social media, because social media is a different animal, and that animal is really disseminating a lot of fake news that in some cases political actors put it into place. How we're going to be reducing that? I don't know if it's regulation or self-regulation. Here in the United States, Facebook and Twitter are taking into hands the control of what they consider non-serving the public information. And they are on their side removing information that they consider that is inappropriate or inaccurate or faked. But I don't know that it's going to be very effective. I think that it's going to be, it's a patching situation until we educate the public to see the difference between what is fake, what is real. In other words,
that's fine.
Yeah, media literacy is the key for that.
Yes, I agree.
I completely agree. Also, I wanted to mention something else also. So it's the media literacy. Not everybody has it, of course. So we need to educate, as you mentioned. So the question, I mean, the tips we can say is question the source. Where does this message come from? Is it a scientific evidence? And if so, who said so? And then go into deeper in the content itself. So if your relative sends you a new study about hydroxychloroquine, question, where does the study come from? Look at the information on the study, how many people were involved in the study. So this is also related to scientific literacy, which might not be the case. It's not only media, it's about scientific literacy applied to the health field. Yeah. And we can have another seminar on this only, so how to deal with fake news.
Oh, yeah. That's a good idea. Okay, so in a democracy, citizens' right to know is fundamental right. Can the citizens sue the authority for curbing, limiting, or blocking it? Marco.
I would say yes, of course they should, but the problem is there needs to be, so because this is the paradoxical element of democracies, the checks and balances needs to be in place. So there needs to be a mechanism or a process whereby citizens can really exert their right. Again, it's not easy to generalize. We cannot do generalizations here, but I think this is an important aspect. So can there be a class action whereby the citizens of a country sue the government for hiding the information? Maybe. I wonder so. I would sign up for that, honestly, but I don't know if there's a possibility for that.
Yeah. Agreed.
And Manuel, how do we handle a situation where communication is tainted with doubts, so many doubts?
How do we make sure that the communication leaves us without any doubts? That's a question.
No, when communication is tainted with doubts, so a situation where communication, okay, how can we handle this situation? So that's the case of COVID.
Yes, I think that is precisely following what we're talking about in terms of media literacy and scientific literacy, education. I think that part of the challenge that we have is that a lot of times the media passes the information to the public without trying to understand what they are talking about, and that is a serious challenge. They need to make sure that they compact the information in a way that the public clearly understands without leaving any doubts about what it is and why the decisions are being made and what is the purpose of that decision. I think that it follows everything that we have been saying in terms of media literacy and scientific literacy. I think that that's what it is.
May I add something here?
Yeah.
Stefan? So I think one important aspect here is the transparency, being transparent. So governments or institutions should be upfront saying these are things we don't know, and this is what we don't know yet, because we are really working with big uncertainties with this pandemic. There are a lot of things we still don't know. The scientific community doesn't know. So we need to say, this is today, this is the evidence so far, and because of this evidence, this is the decision we recommend. And tomorrow things might change, so we need to be open to that. And this is what we do here in the university. I'm a member of the committee for the COVID-19, so we are streamlining the communications to our community. And this is precisely what we do. We review the literature, we see what's going on globally, and then we say, okay, this is what the recommendations are as of today. In a week, things might change.
Yeah.
Okay.
And actually, if we follow all the messages that are coming about the vaccination, about the vaccines, that is precisely the point that we need to look into it. Because now we are moving into the next phase, which is the vaccination. And I can tell you that there is crossing messages that don't really fit into the reality of not knowing if the vaccine is going to work and how and who should take it and when. All of those are unknowns, and nobody. Well, you need to be open and clear about it, but that's not happening, at least in the US.
Manuel, were CNN and other news outlets free in covering COVID at the beginning with no limitations? They were free?
Yes, they were very free at the beginning. All the networks in the United States, they were completely free to cover everything. And at the beginning, the person that got more attention, and I have the data too, the person that got more attention from mid-March to mid-April, the person that was the most popular in social media and as a public figure in the United States was Dr. Anthony Fauci. He was the most popular person in the United States. And he was because at that time, all the networks were following him. After April 15, the president switched and he said, let me move up Fauci and I'm going to be the one that is going to give him the information. And then the president started restricting the access that Fauci would have with the networks. This is one thing that if I would be now in Congress, I would go after the president. Why he's limiting Dr. Fauci going into the press? He prohibited him to go into the press. Yeah,
he was jealous of its coverage. It was too popular.
Oh yes, it could be.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
It could be an option. Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly. So yes, the networks were there. All of them were paying attention, but then they started splitting, and then they went into conservative or liberal.
Okay. So I'm so sorry, but we have other questions, but we have no time because the live is stopping at 5:30. Some people also ask for some news from Lebanon and how is the crisis managed by authorities in Lebanon. But it could be very interesting to invite Marco for another seminar to discuss about this very unpleasant recent crisis.
Happy to do so in another time. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you so much for participation. Thank you so much to Manuel and Marco for your presentations, and to all people who were present. And I repeat, we will share with you the materials and the video presentation by Angeles Moreno, so you can see and watch also the video on your own. So thank you so much. And
thank you very much.
Thank you.
And good luck. Good luck with COVID.
We need a lot of
Stay
good luck.
safe.
Good luck to everybody. Exactly.
Okay.
Bye.
And be safe.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Goodbye
Ciao.
to everybody. Ciao.
Ciao.
Okay, thank you so much to our professor and our guests. Just some last communication for our students and our audience. As Professor told you, we are going to send you all the presentation and the videos tomorrow. Then you will receive also the certificates by the 20th of September. And I would like to invite you to follow us on our social media, and in order to be updated on our initiatives similar to this one, if you liked it. And thank you very much for being with us. And we really appreciate your time and your participation. So thank you very much to everybody and also to our guests. Let's hope to see you soon.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.